Sesardic. I'm originally Croatian. I live in Canada now, have lived here for 11 years in Vancouver, BC. I started my career in operations, and then I moved into tech after that, after about 3.5 years. Started my job in tech as a business analyst, moved into a product manager role. I worked on a small startup team within a fintech organization. After that, I led an innovation team as a product manager for 6 months. At that point, I got my first taste of entrepreneurship and decided to essentially leave my job as a product manager to pursue my entrepreneurial journey. So it's about a year in, and it's been a lot of ups and downs, but it's been a lot of fun.
Nice. Yeah, I'm super excited to hear about your entrepreneurial journey. But before we get there, let's talk about how you got into product. My journey into product, it took about 3 years and I couldn't find like a roadmap to get straight in. It seems like every organization is a little different. Every job description is a little bit different. So what was your journey into products like?
Sure, yeah. I'm one of those accidental product managers, which is really frustrating for aspiring product managers. It doesn't really necessarily give you, like you said, a roadmap or anything to get into product. But the way it happened for me, as I mentioned, I started my career in operations. I was working for a small English language testing company for immigration. Very random. I got really interested in data analysis, and I've always been pretty, good with numbers. I like math, and I like analyzing things and kind of making decisions based on that. So, had my heart set on data analysis. So I did a certification in Excel, and I was really just trying to kind of progress my career in a more technical way. I ended up bumping into one of my girlfriends from my university who was a recruiter at the time, and she was hiring for a business analyst for a large fintech organization. I first said that I'm not interested in business analysis. I just want to do data analysis. But she ended up actually convincing me to apply for the job. And later, when I researched business analysis, I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. It's actually better than data analysis. So that was actually my first mistake, just being really narrow and very rigid on what I was looking for. I think the key is just to really be as open as possible in terms of your opportunities. So anyway, I applied for the business analyst job. I ended up getting hired on their emerging products team that only had about 3 people on it at the time. So my boss, who was the director of the department, he had just prototyped a new web application. So he needed people that were willing to kind of deal with the wild, wild west, essentially, and just scale this application, get some first enterprise customers on board. So I was doing the role of a business analyst, but also kind of a hybrid. So I was doing a little bit of coding as well. No coding experience, but startup environment, just have to kind of roll with it. I did a lot of, customer work in terms of, scaling the platform to these multiple enterprise customers. So I was doing that for about a year. And because I was one of the early people on the team, I really learned the application inside out, including the technology. Like by about 6 months in, I was, really comfortable with a lot of the code and kind of talking with the developers and stuff. And so at that point in that company, there actually were no product managers. They only had business analysts. They're a bit of an older corporation, so that's kind of how they were set up. And so my boss, about a year in, he realized that, we need product managers for this product that he had created. And so he essentially started telling me about product management. I'd never heard of it before, but the way he described it, I really liked it because it was kind of just the perfect combination of dealing with customers, working with developers, and also being involved in the strategy. I just felt like it was a nice kind of interdisciplinary role. So essentially, he got the approval from the company to create roles for product managers. And at that point, I was promoted to be a product manager. I probably did a minimal interview, but it was kind of like an internal progression. So that's essentially how I got into product. There's not really any kind of magic that happened, but I think what I can say is that it was sort of like 3, 4 years in the making because when I was in operations, I didn't want to stay in operations. I wanted to do something different. I wasn't really sure what that was. And then because of the opportunities I went after and sort of the types of goals that I had around being a little more technical, being involved with customers, it kind of just led me to that path. And then I essentially became a product manager.
Nice. Yeah, I love that you said you were in the startup environment and learned to code. You just coded because that was what the startup needed. And reflecting on my time in product management so far, that really is one of the key skill set of PM is just there's not a lot of definition to it, and you got to be willing to take on and be curious and learn new things, like programming. I'm actually in the same boat as you were, where trying to learn about APIs and learn a little bit of
Hmm.
Java and BigQuery, right? So and then being data driven, I mean, that's so important. I think that a lot of teams, me coming from a retail background, we're always talking about data, always talking about KPIs. And so I think a lot of people don't realize how much data lives and exists in their existing roles. So
Hmm.
I love that you were a business analyst first, and then kind of grew into it. Um, After being out of product management now and being a solopreneur, reflecting on it, how would you define product management to maybe a newer or aspiring PM? How would you define the role?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. I think my definition of product management, I kind of touched on this previously. It's sort of like an interdisciplinary role. And I think with that, you really have to be someone who's comfortable with unknowns and not really like a lack of boundaries and the ability to actually set those boundaries for yourself. So really the best way that I can describe it is you're sort of like the glue between the customer, the developers, the designers, the salespeople. Like you're really right in the middle, and you're sort of the one that actually coordinates the whole execution with the view that the product will benefit well, whatever decisions you've made. So you're essentially driving the future of the product, but not by just deciding everything on your own, but you actually have to work with all the different teams and understand their needs. The customer typically is the most important stakeholder, but there's a lot of different other stakeholders that you're going to have to deal with. So it's really like like an interpersonal skill based role, I believe, that just kind of mushes everything, all the different perspectives, organizes them, and then decides on a way to propel forward in terms of the product.
Yeah, I mean, just your definition of being the glue is so spot on from my experience so far. It's almost like product manager, like the title of product manager is kind of deceiving because you don't really manage anyone.
Exactly.
It's you more so, like you said, just listen to people. You listen to the dev team, listen to the stakeholders, listen to the customers. Really, really good definition there.
I think
What?
that's the biggest thing that people trip up on
Yeah.
is, and there's this talk of like, the product manager being the CEO of the product. I don't know how much of it I really agree with, because at the end of the day, like literally no one reports to you. And that was the biggest thing that I learned as a product manager. It's like developers don't have to listen to you, and they honestly won't. Neither will designers, neither will customers. Like no one owes you anything. You have to actually really build that trust and that rapport and build up the credibility, because your words alone essentially mean nothing. You have to back it up with evidence and then rally people around your decision. So it's a lot more complicated than, having a lot of authority over a bunch of people and telling them what to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, no. So speaking of rallying people around like a decision, what are some tips that you would have for people around just specifically like rallying teams, rallying the dev? Like what were some tricks that you used as a PM?
Yeah, great question. One of the things that I kind of started doing really early on, and this really builds credibility, and you can't really force it. You have to really believe in the product and actually the future of it. There's product managers who I know, maybe they aren't necessarily, obsessed with the industry that they're in, but they really care about the product that they're working on. They care about the customer, and it actually matters to them that things succeed. So being able to get into that headspace and also showing that to everyone in the organization is really important, because if someone realizes you're just trying to do a really good job for the company, it's a lot easier for them to get on board, as opposed to you just kind of going off on your own agenda. The other thing that I kind of did that really helped me was just really trying to help a lot of different teams, which kind of goes against the whole thing where product managers end up getting, inundated with all kinds of different tasks, and we have no time left for our own work. So, that caveat aside, I really built up my career and credibility as a product manager by just being helpful to sales teams. For example, the documentation team, everyone hates documentation. I'm a documentation freak, so it kind of worked out for me. But the documentation team at the fintech organization sometimes would get left behind because it was like an afterthought, documenting the features. People found it boring. But I kind of tried to make an effort to give them, more material about what was happening with the product, help them edit the documentation, the online help for the customers, and just kind of being willing to be in the weeds and do the actual groundwork really builds credibility and gets people on board with your vision. The last thing I'll mention is a little more specific to kind of working with developers. I developed kind of like it's like a value exchange system. So, and this really kind of prepares you for being an entrepreneur, where you have to now go out and talk to customers, and no one owes you anything. You have to give in order to receive, right? And it was the same thing with the developers. There'd be certain situations where there's a feature that I'd like them to build because of reasons ABC, but for some reason they don't really want to do it. Maybe the tech is really messy, like the code, there's a lot of tech debt, where they just don't like the idea. Developers are a very special breed and very kind of interesting to work with, and in the best way possible. And so what I kind of ended up doing was like making little like deals with them, where if you do this for me, I'll let you kind of work on this cool thing, or like if you fix this issue for me really quickly right now, like we'll whiteboard this new concept that you want to work on, and kind of like getting them excited about something else and exchanging values. Like I think there's a lot of barter that goes on that shows that you're not just on your own agenda, you're actually going to give back, and you care about your team doing meaningful work. So if you're going to make them do something that's going to be a little bit crappy, exchange it with, next time we'll get to do something cool, like you'll get to work on something better. So just being aware that you have to really, exchange those little deals to kind of get forward sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, just spot on. You gave so many gems just now. Let me try to just break them all down and reflect on them. So like first point you talked about is like the relationship pieces. You talked about going to like the sales teams and the dev team and everybody and building relationships. And again, back to manager being the wrong name, it's really such a relationship and soft skill driven role. Because what I found is that one relationship that you build and you deliver a feature without involving that relationship or listening to that person, you're going to have a blind spot. And the more relationships, I think, and the more feedback you get, you mentioned vision, it improves your vision, right? And
You touched on a really important thing there, which is you have blind spots as a product manager. So not only do you need to get people on board so that you get to do your vision, what you think is best for the product, but you actually need those people to fill in the blind spots for you. And I think being able to say like, hey, I don't have all the answers, I need you guys on this, that in itself as well builds credibility. So that was a great point you brought up there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And then the next piece, you talked a lot about the development team. And, you know, I think there's different levels to your relationships, at least with my experience so far. First coming in, low trust right away, right? Because I haven't built that trust yet. But and it's funny because you have tickets that maybe you have a fire that comes up and all of a sudden you can't get to it, right? Because it's not in the sprint or whatever, right? And then all of a sudden, the more you build those relationships, the more you show that you're curious and that you really truly serve them, the doors open up, and all of a sudden everybody becomes more flexible and they help you out. And like you said, the barter idea, and just involving them early, like I think you mentioned, like going back to product vision, involving the dev team early, because you can look at it like they're just going to build one API or one database table, or you can involve them in the overall product vision and help them understand how that ladders up to the bigger piece. So yeah, it's definitely something, as a new PM, that's probably one of the most biggest challenges, is understanding and getting to serve the dev team and speaking to them on their terms and showing I'm curious and understanding the language. But once you
Mm-hmm.
do, it just unlocks all kinds of doors.
Exactly. Spot
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. And then, so you actually have a book that you interviewed 20 product managers and talk about their journey. One, I'd love to hear you talk about the book, but even more importantly, what inspired you to build that and make that?
Sure. Yeah, happy to talk about that. So what inspired me to write the book, so it actually wasn't going to be a book. I didn't plan on writing a book at all. It was a couple months after I'd left my job as a product manager, and there's a lot of aspiring product managers that kind of asked me, how did you break into product management, how do I do it? And I found myself kind of telling my story. over and over again. But I felt like my story wasn't really enough to, because it's every path is so different. Just hearing one story doesn't necessarily help you, even if it mirrors the current situation that you're in and their trajectory. It's still just a one-off situation. So my plan was basically to help these people out and just interview a bunch of product managers and get a bunch of different stories, and then write some sort of a blog post around, like, this is some of the paths of how to break into product management. And the crazy thing was, I don't know why I was so surprised by this, but I started interviewing these people, and I specifically picked people that I didn't know before. So I logged into like online communities that I'm part of that are global as well, and just kind of found people I didn't know to interview. Every person I interviewed had such a crazy, unique, interesting, twisted story. And I thought that eventually they would all converge, but every single one of them, I think I did 10 interviews, and every one was so different. Also, the type of product manager they were at that point as well was different. So at that point, I kind of thought, you know what, I'm just going to turn it into a book. I'd read a book called Authority by Nathan Barry, and it talks about kind of self-publishing. My dad's a writer; he's written a ton of books, but he's done it through a publisher. And so I always thought it was this really complicated thing. But Nathan Barry helped me see that you can actually self-publish a book, and you can do it in a decent amount of time without really relying on anyone. So I kind of decided to push myself. It was at the start of my entrepreneurial journey, which, you go on your journey and you're all like happy when you first leave the world. And then 2 months in, you're kind of like, oh, what is going on? And, things aren't working like you expected. So I think I started writing the book was sort of me going back to my comfort zone. I'm comfortable with writing. I was pretty sure that it would be a valuable book. So that's kind of how it turned into the book. And then in terms of actually writing the book, I did the interviews and the writing of the book in 6 months. I wouldn't recommend it. It was really stressful. By the end of it, I was writing for like 8 hours a day, which is so bad because you start to get blinded. But the thing I'm most proud of about that project is that it's fully homegrown. It cost a total of, I think it was just an annual subscription of Grammarly, the paid version. That's the only thing that I essentially paid for. Everything else was done for free. I wrote it on Google Docs. My boyfriend helped me create like the PDF cover. He's not a designer, but we just kind of like figured it out on our own. I converted the EPUB version on my own. I did the Kindle version on my own. It was a lot of work, and all the graphics in the book and stuff, I did it all kind of homegrown, very cheap. And my parents actually edited it for me because they're both writers and editors. So truly like homegrown, and I'm pretty proud of that. Yeah.
That's so awesome. Such a cool story. And I'm going to check out that book, Authority. That's so many good takeaways there.
It's a great one. Yeah.
Nice. So, what takeaways would you like, maybe what are some key points from your book, that you have that you'd like to share with like newer aspiring PMs? And then like, what advice would you have for a newer aspiring product manager?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So in the book, I have the 20 stories, and then I have a last chapter called Takeaways, which has like 8 takeaways that are observed across the stories and kind of tips on patterns I've seen that knowing them help you break into product management. And I'll kind of chat about some of the patterns that I saw. The first thing, which is not what aspiring product managers, especially ones that are getting straight out of university, want to hear, but I do really believe that the job of a product manager is not an entry-level position. It's just, it requires so much maturity around decision-making, knowing how you handle certain situations, experience working with different teams in a prior capacity, and knowing how to communicate with, a QA versus, an executive person versus like a sales leader. Like, you really need to learn all these skills and experience a lot of things before to be able to essentially orchestrate all these people together, right? That was kind of my first, across all the people that I interviewed, the closest people that got into product without really any prior work experience were MBA students. And they'd already done an undergrad, and through the MBA, they'd done some internships. So if they were lucky, they actually got some product management experience. So that's kind of the first thing that I usually start with. And then the second kind of observation that I saw was a lot of them basically worked in roles that either work in conjunction with product managers. So let's say, for example, business analysts, software engineers, marketers, product marketers, um, project managers. So those types of roles, the two key points is that you get to interact with product managers, but more importantly, the chances of you actually being able to do the job of a product manager are higher, because product managers are busy people. They have a ton of things that on their plate at all times. It's pretty easy if they're really busy to be like, let me just help you out with these little things. And then maybe there's a small project that comes around, which is, oh, we don't have, it's still a small project. We don't really want to assign a whole product manager to it. And then maybe you can kind of swoop in and start doing the job. Because the key thing is, trying to apply for a product manager job without anything nearly related to product manager experience is really hard, and it's competitive, right? So there's so many people out there that have some experience. So I think working in a capacity where you are interacting with product managers and where you might have the chance to actually do the job really increases your chances. The third pattern that I saw is kind of also ties into like some like entrepreneurial values, which is around like risk taking. So I found that the people that ended up getting product manager jobs, they usually were promoted within a company that they already worked at. And there's a certain couple things at play. So not only did they already work at that company, but it was typically when the company was going through some sort of a change, like maybe there's a big structural change, maybe there's an acquisition, there's a merger, or extreme growth for a startup, or they're switching from an engineering culture to a product management culture. So anytime that you're near this type of action is when there's more opportunities, right? Like things get restructured, you need a new PM, you need this role, teams get moved around. You've actually have the experience of knowing the business, who the customer is, what the solution is. So you don't actually have to get trained in order to get promoted because you're already part of the company, right? There's one subtlety there that I picked up on that was really interesting. Because you're in the company, you're seeing how these changes are happening. So you're actually privy to that information. So you can actually sometimes predict, I have an inkling that there's going to be an opportunity here, and you can act on it. But if you're outside the company, you don't have that information because you're an outsider, right? So there's a lot of advantages that I saw that led to people getting promoted within the actual corporation. So those are kind of like the biggest patterns that I saw in terms of breaking in. Yeah.
Nice. I mean, they're so spot on. They're so accurate. I spent 17 years in field retail leadership, reading, starting as a sales associate on the floor, selling shoes, and then working my way up to multi-unit management across multiple states. And you really, without PM or tech experience, the way to get in, is find a role at your own organization, because you have that customer, you probably have that customer experience, you have experience understanding your customers, you understand the workings of the customers, and of the internally of the company.
Exactly.
If I have to build a tool for our loss prevention or HR team and I have to integrate, I know I've worked with the leaders, the VPs for years. And so we already have relationships established. So you have a lot of stuff internally that can offset the lack of product management or tech experience on your
Exactly.
resume. So,
Yeah.
well, spot on there. Let's see here. So what books do you recommend for PMs?
Great question. Yeah. Usually I recommend Inspired by Marty Kagan just because it's kind of like the Bible. The way that I recommend reading it as an aspiring product manager is like, don't necessarily feel like you have to read through the whole book. The chapters are like really short, which is like surprising. But I usually like to tell aspiring product managers, like, buy the book, read the parts that are relevant to you right now, and then keep it on the side, because some of the stuff will only be relevant later once you're a product manager, or maybe later when you're a senior product manager. So it's kind of like a nice one to have on the side. I think the other one that I would recommend probably would be Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. It's a bit of an older book, but it still just stands the test of time. He basically just breaks down exactly the product adoption life cycle. The chasm is basically between the early adopters and the early majority, but don't quote me on that. There's a chasm somewhere between the early adopters, early majority, late majority. But the idea, he just basically shows you how companies innovate and how they market those innovations within customers and essentially grow it from the early adopters up to the people, up all the way up to the laggards, right? So I just think it's a good general knowledge of how successful innovative products are built and marketed throughout the different customer categories.
I mean, you're just so spot on. I mean, I bought Inspired during my journey when I was still aspiring to be a PM. And to be honest, I didn't even know like what to look for, what to like grab onto. You kind of get the theme, the overall theme, but I was listening to it again while I was this week while I was walking my dog. It's an audiobook. And I heard the missionary versus mercenary concept. And it's just like mind blowing, now that you're in the role and you see exactly what he's talking
Mm-hmm.
about. So it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely one of those you have to buy. And, I regret not getting the hard copy book because now you want to take notes, you want to
Mm-hmm.
highlight that one.
Mm-hmm.
And then you forgot the making of a product manager definitely is one. I'll slide
Of
that one
course.
for you. Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
definitely got to grab that one, and I'll be grabbing that one tonight also.
Thank you.
And then last question, you're now in a startup. You went product manager to entrepreneur. That is definitely, I think, one of the paths that a lot of PMs aspire to take. What tips do you have around entrepreneurship? And then how long after being in product do you recommend? And when do you know it's time?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent question. So I think I had a tweet and a LinkedIn post that went on a couple weeks ago, and I got quite a lot of views for it. It was very simple. It just said more product managers should be founders, and honestly, it's true because when I first went on my entrepreneurial journey, like I said, first I was on a high, then it very quickly the reality hit, and I was like, this is really hard, and the doubt really sinks in, and then I had this thought, honestly, 6 or 8 months in, where I was like, I actually know how to build software. Like I know entrepreneurs who, like, they don't know how to build software. They're still doing great, but it's a huge advantage. And also just the fact that you've been able to manage these teams and rally people around a vision, like that's basically what an entrepreneur does as well, right? So I think there's just so much overlap. And I'm not saying that every product manager should quit their job to become an entrepreneur. Like, I do also think that there's a lot of opportunity to do side stuff, projects on the side. Maybe you have a newsletter, maybe you have an info product, maybe you build a SaaS, maybe you have an e-commerce site, but you really have that combination of like building products, serving customers, taking care of the business, the bottom line, and stuff like that. And it's just a pity to not implement that in some fashion, even while you're still working at a job, to get side income. I also think it's important for building your portfolio. Like the other day, I read a blog post by some girl who rejected a really crazy offer from Instagram. And the reason why Instagram really pushed her and actually ended up offering her more money was because she had this like amazing online portfolio of her newsletter. She had been sharing her ideas, right? So it's just an extension of your brand. And I think there's also this element of like unpeeling your identity from the current company that you work at. I really don't think people should be defined by, product manager at Google. Like there's more to you than that, right? And I really encourage people to, especially product managers, to explore an identity outside the current company that they work at, right? Um, in terms of the amount of time that like you should spend in product, I mean, I think it's more just depending on what your goals are. Like if you're finding that you have enough skills to actually go out and do it out on your own, and it's kind of very subjective. I think when you start to feel it is really the natural time to go. I know that that's not a very like actionable piece of advice, but I think there's a lot of things that play into it, and you want to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a position where you're now quitting your job and now you're really stressed, and you're low on runway, and now you're in this backed into a corner and trying to force yourself to innovate. I think making a slow step across is probably the better way to go. I decided to quit my job just like that because I luckily had a runway, and I just could. That's just kind of how I did it. But you can definitely step it out slowly. And I definitely recommend having something going before you leave your job. My situation was pretty stressful, so it's nice to kind of see something grow a little bit and then convert over at that point. But I think the biggest kind of piece of advice is, yeah, just start sharing your ideas early. And we all feel like imposters all the time, but and then we discount the experience that we have. Like I said, like I completely forgot that I know how to I take it for granted, because to me the entrepreneurial part of building the software is the least of my worries. I'm like, I know how to do that. It's like finding the idea, finding the problem, and doing the marketing and the sales. That's kind of the challenge. So really take an audit of exactly what you've done and what your skills are and how that can feed into entrepreneurship, and it'll give you a lot more confidence, I think. Yeah.
Oh, so many good points. Actually, it was last week where I was talking to one of our consultant engineer, and he was kind of reviewing APIs with me and helping me understand how APIs, how they work, and how to read like dev docs, so I can like go on like Google Calendar and read the developer docs. And once you learn that about REST APIs, it's like, holy cow, that's like the foundation of every SaaS product is
Hmm.
these APIs, and understanding that then you build software around them, and then you just get that itch, that entrepreneurial itch. So
Hmm.
I love all the points you've made. Anything I didn't ask you, anything else that you want to share that maybe I forgot to ask?
No, I think you covered it all. Yeah.
Awesome. You've shared so many gems this evening. I really appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you?
I'm most active on LinkedIn, so Lena Sesardic. I'm also pretty active on Twitter, Lena Sesardic as well. I tend to try and like build in public and share my journey as transparently as possible. I also have a website, lenasesardic.com, where you can see kind of all the projects I've done, random engagements, and essentially the latest of what I'm up to, including my blog. So, yeah.
That's really cool. I'll link all those in the notes as well. So thank you so much for joining me this evening. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brennan. It was so much
Yep.
fun.
Yep. Likewise.